I brought Valentine flowers to my husband's office and watched him propose to his CEO. Then I made one phone call that cost him everything. I bought the roses at 8:14 in the morning, the flower shop on Broad Street, the one that keeps the door propped open in winter so the smell carries into the cold, cream paper, red ribbon, a handwritten card with 2 first-class tickets to Paris tucked inside, folded around a reservation confirmation for 4 nights at the Hotel Le Maurice, same suite where Jake and I had honeymooned 11 years ago. I remember being happy standing at that counter. I remember thinking, we need this. We've been distant, distracted, but this is the kind of thing that breaks through that. A surprise, a return, something that says, I still choose you, specifically. I was in the atrium of Harlow Reed Technologies at 11:47 a.m. when my husband slid a diamond onto another woman's finger. The crowd erupted around me like I wasn't there, because as far as Jake was concerned, I wasn't. Let me tell you about Jake Carter. I met him in 2011 at a conference in Boston, one of those technology meets medicine events that attracted venture capital money and medical researchers and everyone in between who was trying to connect the two. Jake was 32, lean, focused, with the kind of restless intelligence that presents in some men as magnetism. He had a pitch for a medical data management platform that was genuinely visionary and completely unfunded. He had passion, a laptop, and a slide deck he'd built himself at 2 a.m. He did not have money. That was never the problem because I did. My name is Emma Carter. Before that, it was Emma Renfield. And before my father passed in 2016, the Renfield name meant something specific in certain financial circles in New England. My father, William Renfield, built a private equity portfolio over 40 years that was quiet, careful, and profitable in ways that never made the news because he preferred it that way. He was not a flashy man. He did not do interviews. He believed that visibility was a liability and that the best investment was one nobody was talking about yet. He believed in Jake's idea in 2012, not because Jake Carter was exceptional, but because the medical data management space was about to become enormous and Jake had found a real problem worth solving. My father also believed in me, which is the part of the story that matters more. When he made the initial investment, he structured it through a family holding company, Carter Family Holdings, which I controlled as sole trustee after his death. As Harlow Reed grew through funding rounds and buybacks over 14 years, that holding company's stake grew with it. By February of this year, Carter Family Holdings owned 83% of Harlow Reed Technologies, valued, per the most recent independent assessment, at $558 million. Jake knew every decimal of that figure. He just, somewhere along the way, stopped treating it as relevant. Looking back, the signs were there for longer than I want to admit. The first thing I noticed was his phone. Jake had always been a person who left his phone on the kitchen counter, face up, charger dangling. We were that kind of couple. Not by policy, just by habit. Nothing to hide meant nothing to guard. In August, I noticed the phone was face down. I noticed it 3 times before I acknowledged I had noticed it. I told myself it was nothing. He was under enormous pressure. Harlow Reed was preparing for a secondary offering. He was working 14-hour days and coming home distracted and short-tempered, and that was understandable. That was the cost of building something significant. Then in October, his assistant, a woman named Patricia, who had worked for Jake for 6 years and who sent me Christmas cards with handwritten notes, stopped making eye contact with me at the company holiday preview event. I tried to start a conversation at the catering table and she smiled too broadly and said she needed to check something and left. I told myself Patricia was stressed. Everyone at the company was stressed. In November, I found a hotel receipt in his jacket pocket while dropping his dry cleaning. The Mayflower in Washington, D.C. 1 room, 2 nights. The dates matched a trip Jake had told me was a solo board prep meeting. I held that receipt for a long time in the dry cleaner's parking lot. I put it in my own pocket. I did not confront him. I should explain why. It wasn't passivity, it was calculation. I had been raised by a man who believed that the most dangerous move you could make in any negotiation was to reveal your hand before you understood the full table. I didn't yet understand the full table. I took the receipt home and I photographed it. I started keeping a file on my personal laptop. Not his, not the shared cloud drive, mine. The one with the password only I had ever set. December arrived and Jake started working late on Thursdays specifically. Not randomly late, Thursday late, which is the kind of specific pattern that means something. I drove by the office once at 9:45 p.m. on a Thursday. His car was there. So was a white Audi TT I didn't recognize, parked in the CEO's reserved space. Amanda Blake had been CEO of Harlow Reed for 18 months. Jake had hired her himself. He'd talked about her in the abstract. Brilliant, aggressive, exactly what the company needed for the next phase. I had met her twice at company events. Briefly, the way spouses meet the professional world of a partner they trust, with a smile and a handshake and no particular reason to look closer. I looked closer now. I found her LinkedIn profile at midnight on a Thursday in December. I scrolled through her history, her photos, her public posts about the company. I was looking for something, and I didn't know exactly what until I found it. A photo from a company retreat in October. Mountains. A fire pit. Candid. Laughing. Jake was in the back left of the frame. Amanda was beside him. Their chairs were not touching. Their expressions were not incriminating. There was nothing in that image that would mean anything to a stranger. But I knew my husband's body language. I had been reading it for 11 years, and something in the angle of his shoulders, the way he was leaning, fractionally in her direction, made the receipt in my pocket feel suddenly heavier. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark of my home office and I breathed very carefully for several minutes. I did not call Martin Keller yet, but I started thinking about what I would say when I did. January passed in a particular kind of fog. The fog of knowing something you're not yet ready to name, of functioning normally while part of your brain is quietly running a different calculation entirely. entirely. I attended 2 of Jake's board dinners. I made conversation. I smiled when he introduced me. I watched Amanda Blake across tables at industry events, and I noticed how she talked to him and how he listened, and I filed every data point in the folder on my personal laptop. By early February, the folder had 43 entries. The Paris trip was not denial. I want to be clear about that. I had not decided Jake was innocent. I had decided I needed to be certain before I acted, and I had decided that, just possibly, a return to something foundational between us might reveal which version of reality I was actually living in. Maybe I was building a case against an innocent man. Maybe the charges I was marshalling were the projections of a woman who had been unhappy and distant herself and was looking for external cause. I booked the hotel in January. I ordered the tickets on February 2nd. On Valentine's Day morning, I bought the roses. The atrium at Harlow Reed was not what I expected. I knew the building, obviously. I had been there dozens of times, had attended board meetings in the conference rooms upstairs, had walked through the lobby and nodded to the security desk. But on this particular Tuesday morning, the lobby had been transformed. Gold balloons. A string quartet. Not a violinist, I should say. A full quartet. Playing something romantic and instrumental that echoed under the glass ceiling. The company logo was projected on the main wall in soft light. 200 employees were gathered below, holding champagne flutes, facing the elevated platform at the center of the atrium. I stood in the entrance, flowers in hand, Paris tickets in my bag, and for one disorienting moment I thought, a company event. I didn't know about a company event. Then I saw Jake on the platform. He was in his best suit, the dark navy one I had picked out with him 2 years ago. He was standing next to Amanda Blake, who was laughing at something he'd just said, her hand against his forearm, and Jake had that expression on his face that I had seen at our wedding, at the birth of our niece. At the exact moment his company hit its first billion in valuation. The expression of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. He reached into his jacket pocket. He dropped to one knee. The crowd erupted around me. People were crying. Someone near my left shoulder whispered, "Oh my God, they're perfect together." Amanda pressed both hands to her mouth. Her eyes went bright with tears. Jake opened the velvet box. I knew the diamond cut immediately. Pear-shaped, slightly east-west. I had pointed to a photo of that cut in a magazine once, years ago, and said, "That's the most beautiful setting I've ever seen." I had said it to Jake. I remembered the conversation precisely because he had been distracted, and I had said it again, and he had looked at the magazine and said, "Yeah, that's something." He had remembered. He had just used it for someone else. The woman to my left turned to share the moment with the person nearest her and found me instead. She smiled, tearful and happy and completely certain of what she was witnessing. Then Jake stood up. His eyes swept the atrium in the reflexive way of someone accustomed to owning a room, and they landed on me. Standing in the entrance, cream paper roses in my arms, a card with Paris tickets tucked inside. His smile disappeared, not slowly, instantly, like a power cut. He did not move. He did not call my name. He did not step off the platform. He stood on the elevated surface with his newly engaged CEO beside him, and he looked at me with the specific expression of a man watching a consequence arrive. Amanda followed his gaze to me. Her expression was polite, curious, slightly confused. She mouthed across the celebrating crowd, "Do we know each other?" That was when I understood that he had told her nothing. Not, "I have a wife and we're separated." Not, "I'm in the process of a divorce." Not even, "It's complicated." Nothing. He had built an entire relationship, an engagement apparently, on the premise that I didn't exist. He had not cheated and hidden it. He had erased me completely and replaced the whole architecture of his life. The roses were heavy. My arms were very still. I set the flowers on a chair near the entrance. I placed them carefully because I was not going to throw them, and I was not going to make a scene, and I was not going to give 200 employees a story they would tell at dinner parties for years. I turned around and I walked out. The parking garage was 3 floors underground. I don't remember the elevator. I remember sitting behind the wheel of my car, the cream paper flowers on the passenger seat where I'd put them without thinking, the Paris envelope on my lap. My hands were completely steady. That was the strangest thing. I had expected shaking or nausea or the specific physical sensation of a world reorganizing around a new fact. Instead, I felt very clear, the way air goes clear just before a storm. Rage, when it gets clean enough, goes quiet. I opened my phone. First, the travel app. Paris canceled. First class refund requested. The Paris envelope went into the glove compartment. Second, our bank. I called the relationship manager directly, a man named Stuart Fruin at Northeast Private Banking who had managed our accounts for 7 years. I told him I needed to speak to someone about freezing joint accounts requiring mutual authorization under the marital asset agreement. Stuart was quiet for a moment. "Emma, is everything? I need it done today," I said. "I'll make some calls right now." Third, Martin Keller. Martin Keller has been practicing family and asset law in Connecticut for 29 years. He handled my father's estate. He drafted the trust documents for Carter Family Holdings in 2018. He is 71 years old, precise, unhurried, and very nearly unflappable. He picked up on the second ring. "Emma, what happened?" "My husband just got engaged to his CEO." A pause. "I'm on my way to the office." "No," I said. "Start with the holding company. I need you to review the equity commitment documents for Harlow Reed. Every clause, every mechanism I have." Another pause. This one the kind that means he is already thinking. "How soon do you need this?" "He'll be on the phone with the board before 5 o'clock." I said. "I need to be ahead of that." "Give me 2 hours." Martin said. I drove home. Quick pause. "If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description." Jake called 47 times before I reached the driveway. By the time I parked, it was 112. I sat in the driveway and watched the number climb and thought about the hotel receipt and the Thursday evenings and the photo from the mountain retreat and the 4 words from across a crowded atrium. "Do we know each other?" 152 calls calls by the time I unlocked my front door. I did not answer a single one. Jake was on the porch 40 minutes after I got home. Same suit, tie slightly crooked. His face had the particular sheen of a man who ran from a warm atrium into Connecticut February air and didn't notice the cold because something more urgent was happening. I opened the front door halfway. He said, "Emma, it wasn't what it looked like." I waited. "I was going to tell you. There was never a right." "Emma, the timing was—" "What did it look like?" I asked. "Tell me." He stopped. His mouth opened and the words, for once, weren't there. Jake Carter had never been at a loss for language in the entire time I had known him. He built companies with language. He charmed boards and journalists and investors with language. He had told me he loved me in language that I had believed completely for 11 years. Behind him, his phone started ringing. He looked at the screen. The color left his face in a single wave like something draining. He looked at me. "Emma, what did you do?" "I protected what belongs to me." His face changed. I had seen that change before. In boardrooms, when a term sheet came back wrong, when a funding round stalled, the pivot from shock to calculation. Jake Carter in crisis mode was not a man who collapsed. He was a man who started looking for exits. "You can't unilaterally pull capital from a public company," he said. "There are SEC regulations, fiduciary obligations, the board will, there are clauses," I said. "And you signed them." I closed the door. Martin Keller called me at 4:15 to tell me what I already knew, but needed confirmed in his voice. The equity commitment withdrawal was valid. The clauses were clear. Carter Family Holdings had the right, under specific conditions relating to material misrepresentation and breach of fiduciary trust by the executive chairman, to suspend capital commitment pending review. He represented himself as unmarried, Martin said, inside a company where the majority capital is held by his spouse. That is a material misrepresentation with fiduciary implications. How solid is the position? Extremely. A pause. His personal attorney will call it an overreach. They'll argue it's punitive. The SEC filing may get complicated depending on how the board responds. What do you recommend? Attend the board meeting tonight, Martin said. Let the structure speak for itself. Don't perform anger. Don't perform anything. You are the majority stakeholder exercising documented rights. That is all. The emergency board meeting was at 7:30 p.m. Virtual. Called by the chairman within an hour of my conversation with Martin. I had dressed carefully. Dark blazer, my father's watch. I sat at my home office desk with Martin Keller on one side of the screen and 5 board members on the other, and Jake Carter in his own office, under the framed magazine cover that called him the man who reinvented medical data. The chairman was a man named Gerald Forsyth, 30 years in corporate governance, former partner at a Big Four firm, the kind of man who keeps his voice level regardless of the circumstances, because he has long since learned that tone is the first thing lawyers look at in a transcript. We've received formal notice that Carter Family Holdings has withdrawn its equity commitment and suspended all capital support, effective immediately. Gerald looked into the camera with the expression of a man performing steadiness for the benefit of the record. "Mrs. Carter, can you confirm the notice is authentic?" "Yes." "And that Carter Family Holdings remains the beneficial owner of 83% of Harlow Reed Technologies?" "Yes." The silence that followed was the specific silence of people doing math they had been avoiding. For years, the ownership structure of Harlow Reed had existed on paper the way uncomfortable truths often exist, acknowledged in documents, never fully integrated into the operating reality. Jake was the face. Jake's name was in the press. Jake stood at podiums and accepted awards and gave interviews about vision and disruption and the future of healthcare data. Jake Carter, founder of Harlow Reed. The stories wrote themselves. Somewhere in those years, the gap between visibility and ownership had quietly become immense. Jake had believed his own press release. That was the only explanation I had ever come to that made complete sense. He leaned toward his camera. "Emma." His voice had the quality of a man trying to project reason while something internal was accelerating dangerously. "I understand you're upset. I understand today was— I made no decisions today," I said. "I executed rights that have existed for 14 years. He stopped. "Mr. Carter." Gerald Forsyth looked directly into his camera with the expression of a man setting down something heavy. "I need to ask you a direct question for the record. Did you represent yourself inside this company? To the board? To investors? To Amanda Blake as CEO? As unmarried?" Jake's jaw tightened. "I fail to see what relevance— Did you represent yourself as unmarried?" The silence stretched. "Yes." "Were you in fact married at the time of Ms. Blake's appointment as CEO?" "Yes." The general counsel, a woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, Yale Law, 18 years in corporate governance, set down her pen on camera with a deliberateness that felt final. "I want to note for the record," she said, "that the appointment of Amanda Blake as CEO of Harlow Reed was approved by this board based on representations made by the executive chairman that included no disclosure of a personal relationship. That constitutes a material conflict of interest that was not disclosed to the board." She looked at Gerald Forsyth. "I recommend placing Mr. Carter on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into the representation made to this board." Jake looked into the camera. "You cannot be serious." Gerald Forsyth looked back at him and said the quietest, most devastating thing I had heard in 11 years of watching my husband occupy rooms. "I wish we weren't." What happened in the 96 hours after that board meeting is partly public record and partly things I know from people who were present. Jake retained outside counsel within an hour, a firm in Manhattan that specializes in high-stakes executive disputes. They filed a challenge to the equity commitment withdrawal the following morning, arguing it exceeded the legal basis of the relevant clauses. Martin Keller and his associate, Rebecca Cho, 2 years out of Harvard Law and sharp in a way that reminded me of my father, had been prepared for exactly that. The counter-response was filed by noon. Amanda Patricia Blake resigned as CEO on day 3. She released a statement through her own publicist that said, in part, that she had entered into a relationship based on representations that had since proven to be inaccurate. The statement was careful and correct, and I felt, reading it, something complicated that was not quite sympathy, but was not quite its opposite either. She had been lied to. That was real. Her culpability was a different question from her injury, and I didn't have the bandwidth to hold both simultaneously, so I set it aside. The SEC filing was complicated, exactly as Martin had warned. It took 6 weeks. I will not detail it entirely here except to say that the outcome confirmed the validity of Carter Family Holdings' position and required Harlow Reed to make corrective disclosures to shareholders regarding the circumstances of executive leadership over the prior 18 months. Jake's name appeared in those filings. So did mine, for the first time, publicly, in a way that could not be summarized away or reduced to founder's wife. The divorce took 14 months. Martin Keller and Rebecca Cho were very good at what they did. I was a patient client, which Martin told me was the rarest and most valuable quality in a client going through something like this. I did not make reactive decisions. I did not call Jake from parking garages at midnight. I attended every required meeting and I answered every document request. And I did not perform devastation for anyone's benefit, including my own. I won't tell you I didn't grieve. I did. 11 years is not nothing. And whatever Jake Carter became in those last years, I had loved who he was before. I sat in my father's chair in the home office on nights I couldn't sleep, and I looked at photographs from the Le Maurice on our honeymoon, 27 years old, so certain of where we were going, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had been lost. Then I put the photographs away. Then I went back to work. Harlow Reed is still operational. The board brought in an interim CEO in the weeks after Jake's leave, and I worked closely with Gerald Forsyth and Dr. Huang to stabilize the company through the disclosure period. The platform itself, the medical data management system Jake had pitched at that Boston conference in 2011, was still genuinely valuable. That had always been true. I had always believed in the idea. I just hadn't been the idea. Carter Family Holdings retained its 83% stake. I restructured the board. I brought in people I trusted, including 2 that my father had worked with in his own career, who understood what this kind of careful, quiet work looked like. 3 months after the board meeting, I drove past the Harlow Reed building on my way to a meeting. The company logo was still on the side of the building. The sign in the atrium, I'd been told, had been updated. A new design, more contemporary. Jake's framed magazine cover was no longer in the executive suite. The building is still there, just under different management. The roses, as it happens, I left in the atrium. I found out later from a woman who worked at reception, not maliciously, she just mentioned it when she left the company months later and we crossed paths, that the flowers stayed on the chair in the entrance for the entire event. After the proposal, after the champagne, after everyone dispersed, someone found them and assumed they were part of the decor. They were moved to the reception desk and displayed there for 3 days in cream paper and red ribbon before someone asked where they'd come from. Nobody knew. I like that detail more than I can fully explain. Jake spent 11 years letting everyone believe he built a company. He forgot he'd been building it on my name.